I'm here today with Lamar Hardwick, also known as the Autism Pastor. Lamar is the author of a new book titled Disability in the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion from InterVarsity Press. He's the lead pastor at Tri-Cities Church in East Point, Georgia, and the author of several previous books, including Epic Church and the best-selling I Am Strong, The Life and Journey of an Autistic Pastor. In 2014, at the age of 36, after years of silently struggling with social anxiety, sensory processing disorder, and a host of other significant issues, Lamar was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. He now provides workshops, seminars, and consults with local churches and faith-based organizations on creating environments for people with autism. He also provided mentoring services for teens and young adults on the autism spectrum. His writing has been published in various autism and disability websites, including The Mighty, the Huffington Post, Key Ministry, and the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Lamar, it's really great to have you here with us today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Well, it's our pleasure, so I really appreciate it. Maybe first you can tell us a little bit more about your background besides the things I just touched on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess maybe some highlights of my background. I was raised in a military family. My father spent, over 20 years, I think somewhere close to 25 years in the military. And I share that with people because they often ask, how is it possible that I got diagnosed so late in life? One of the issues that my therapist that diagnosed me believes that contributes to that is the fact that as a military family, we moved just about every 3 years. So most people didn't expect me to adjust well. And so, being a part of the military is a big part of that. I also share that because, it taught me at an early age to give my life to something greater than myself. So the fact that my dad was a military man and also a minister was very much an impression on why I do the things I do today, because we learned at an early age that life was bigger than us and there are other people depending on us to serve. I guess the audience should also know I'm married. My wife and I, Isabella, have been married for 20 years. We have 3 beautiful boys, ages one soon to be 16. Our middle child will be 13 in October, and our youngest turns 8 today. So happy birthday, Miles.
Yes, happy birthday.
Yeah, so he's 8 today. As you said, I'm a lead pastor. I've been in ministry since my early 20s. And so I was actually in ministry before I was diagnosed. But being diagnosed helped me to understand why I had such a difficult time trying to find a place to fit into the church world, into ministry. But as you said, I was in 2014, so I was 36 at the time. And that came as a result of a lifelong struggle, but not really having the language to describe what I had always struggled with, up until I ran into what I call the proverbial wall when I was transitioning into the lead pastor role at a church that I formerly pastored. And I really ran into a really, really difficult time. And really a lot of the self-talk coping mechanisms started to catch up with me, and they didn't work anymore. And so I finally asked my wife to help me after I did about a year of my own investigation, just listening to what people were saying, things that I heard my whole life, but people having interactions with me that obviously didn't go well, but I was all the more aloof to why they didn't go well. And so I had to ask myself the question, what do people experience when they experience me? And that led me down a path where I didn't like having to ask that question. But eventually I decided that everyone can't be wrong about the things that they're saying about the social interactions with me, things about my facial expressions, body language, things that I didn't even know existed up until that time. And so after about a year of doing my own investigation, I finally got the courage to tell my wife that I think I know what's going on. I think I know what some of our communication challenges are. And so she helped me to find someone that officially diagnosed me on the autism spectrum in 2014.
Wow. Well, that had to be tough to figure that out on your own.
Yeah. And like I said, probably around the age of 7 or 8, I started to realize there were differences between me and the other children. I took things very literal. I would hear other kids say that I sound like a robot, or in those days it was Transformers were the deal, because my voice didn't intonate very much. And so, kids would say things, and after a while you learn to deny, defend, deflect, so that you don't get bullied. And I just carried that all the way into adulthood. But then realize that, I've been hearing this my whole life. People are experiencing interactions with me that are much different than what I think they are. And so everybody can't be wrong. Even though I don't enjoy some of the things that were being said, but what I realized that people were making objective observations about interactions with me. So I decided to dig into that a little bit further.
Wow. Well, good for you for figuring it all out and, doing something about it.
Yeah, it was tough. It was difficult, but at the point where it was at, it became necessary. I couldn't use any of the strategies that I had taught myself. They weren't working anymore. So I needed help.
Wow. Well, tell us a little bit about the previous books that you've written before the new one that just came out.
Yeah. So prior to this most recent book, I've written 2 books. One is, I started with Epic Church, and really it's just a rewrite of a version of my dissertation for my Doctor of Ministry program. And so with that book, I just did research on leadership transitions in churches and other organizations, and figuring out how to leverage those leadership vacancies to make the organization stronger. And so it's actually written during the time that I was actually being considered to be the lead pastor of my former church. So I was actually able to do research on that whole thing, to see, how can we actually make this church stronger, and come up with some 5 steps basically, that I felt like, after doing months of research, surveying not just our church, but other churches, leaders, and figuring out that, when there are leadership vacancies, that's actually the best time to assess the health of the organization and to make tweaks, because when there is no quote unquote leader, you actually find out how strong the organization really is and what the culture really is, not what we say it is. And so we took that research and turned that into not just my dissertation, but a year or 2 later, I turned it into a book. And then the other book was written after I was diagnosed in 2014. In 2015, I disclosed my diagnosis to my former church, and eventually to the world. I had started writing and blogging, and it began to get more popular. And so then in 2017, I released the book, I Am Strong, which is really an autobiography, but it's fused with different stories from the Bible, helping people to understand what that was like growing up, but also helping people to understand how to leverage their quote unquote difference to make a difference in the world. So it's about being diagnosed on the autism spectrum, but in a broader term, it's to help people to realize that, different doesn't mean deficient. And sometimes in order to make a difference, you have to be willing to be different.
Very interesting. So I always find it really fascinating to hear how people got their first couple book deals. Mm-hmm. They're just usually a very interesting story. So how did that come about for you?
Wow. So my first 2 are traditionally published, but they're really smaller publishers. So really, I just had to knock down the door of everyone who would listen until I found someone who would give me a book deal. And so I was leaning towards self-publishing, but I felt like I can probably get this story out here. And so it was really just going down the list. Every time I read a book, I found out who published that book. And then I did research on that publisher, and I did my own research on how to do query letters and I did a lot of that work on my own because I didn't have an agent or anything like that. And so the first two, really, I wrote I Am Strong probably 2015, 2016. And it took me probably a year to 18 months to find someone. So it was already fully written by the time I got the publisher that would sign on and do it. And sort of the same with Epic Church. That one was a little bit easier. But with InterVarsity Press, that was a entirely different experience. By that time, I had been speaking at disability ministry conferences, and I made some connections, particularly with the people at Key Ministry, who I'm a writer for them. And one of the talks that I did at the first or second conference that I spoke at for them seemed to really resonate with people. It was about disability and diversity. And so I actually made a connection with someone there who at the time worked for them, who after the conference introduced me to my now agent, Karen, with Credo Communications. And from there.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I know Karen really well.
Yeah, she's great. And so from there, we just went to work on the proposal. They loved the idea of writing the book about disability and diversity. And so from there, we shopped it around, and Karen did a great job. And from the beginning, she thought InterVarsity would be the best home for this book, seeing their commitment to, social justice issues and authors of color. But also it was a lane that there are not many voices of color talking about disability ministry or disability theology. So she thought that was from the beginning a good place. So we shopped it around to other places, but we ended up landing with InterVarsity Press, which it's been a joy to work with them.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know a lot of the folks at IVP, well, I have a great respect for what they've done.
Mm-hmm.
And Karen that Lamar was referring to as Karen Newmeyer from Credo Communications.
Yes.
Spoken at several of our conferences as well.
Yeah.
So what was the motivation for you to create this particular book, the new one, the Disability in the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion?
Yeah, I as I stated, I was starting to do a lot of speaking at conferences. After a few years of writing online, then being asked to write for the Key Ministry team. And, I was writing for a couple of other places. I wrote a pretty popular article in Christianity Today about this subject back in 2017. And so one of the things that prompted this was, one, the talk that I gave about disability and diversity. It had such a great response by the people who were attending, but also those who were online at the time who were watching. But then also I noticed in my traveling that I would get great people who would come to my table. They were empowered by the conference. They were enthusiastic, but after about 2 years of doing this conference circuit at different conferences, I found that I never ran into any pastors or church leaders. Most of the people who were coming to these conferences were lay leaders or volunteers, and they had all the passion and they were ready to try to make the churches more inclusive. But as a pastor, I knew that nothing really happens in the church that's not important to the pastor and the leaders.
Yeah, of course.
And so I realized that I wanted to write a book that spoke to pastors, but it was also accessible to volunteers, families, and lay leaders so that they can have an intelligent, strong conversation with the leadership of the church to help them understand how important this is. But then also there were very few, if not any, that were talking about disability in the context of diversity. And so, as our culture was pushing towards diversity, mostly racial and ethnic, our churches were doing the same, and they should. But I thought that was the missing piece, because the largest minority group in the world is persons with disabilities. And so I felt like if we're going to have that conversation, we need to zoom out a little bit and talk about what is a grossly underrepresented population in faith communities, and that's the disability community. So I wanted to talk about that and tie that all together, and then give some ways that the church can do better.
Well, good for you. Good for you. I think it is an area that is being raised in awareness, is my
Mm-hmm.
sense, in people's minds, that, it's been overlooked for a long time. And, just what little I've heard, it seems like churches are coming to a realization that they need to do more in this area.
Yeah, and one of the things I talk about in the book is that historically, and I'll just speak about the church in the West, primarily, the U.S. and Canada. We historically haven't done a very good job at that, especially in the West. When a good example of that is the 1990 ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. The church, and I say the church universal, in the West, opted to use this religious exemption to not be held accountable to that. And I think that sent a bad message to the disability community. And so we're trying to overcome that. Now, many churches do have accommodations, mostly physical, the ramps, the bathrooms, those types of things, as they should. But there are other ways that the church needs to become more inclusive and more accessible. And I think that we're trying to overcome that bad decision of seeking exemption from the ADA, because I think it really hurt our witness. And it's all throughout the Bible how God has an affinity for this marginalized community. And so I think we just need to zero in on that and understand how important it is.
Sure. Wow. So what would you say is the number one message that you hope people take away from your book?
I would say that the number one message is that the church, from my experience, and of course I wasn't diagnosed until I was 36. And again, I did have a lot of significant challenges, but there's still this affinity that I have for the church, because when it was working right in those pockets and seasons, it was very much a huge support system for me, even before I knew what the label was that I would be diagnosed with. So what I realized is if the church, when it's clicking on all cylinders and it's working right, is a huge support system to me, I can imagine how big of a support system it could be for others. And even, throughout my time on social media and eventually changing my social media handles to Autism Pastor, which, by the way, was a term that someone coined for me. I didn't come up with that myself.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah, I had a woman who early on in my writing, because I would get so many messages from the autism community, many of them who didn't have a church. She told me that I was like their pastor, because they didn't have a church. And so most of them would come to me for prayer or counsel or mentoring, or how to handle something, watch my services, whatever church I was at. And so that phrase, she didn't quite title it like that, but that phrase came from her. And so I actually changed my handles to that because it made it easier for people to find me on social media.
Of course. Yeah. It's a great handle. I mean, you were able to get it.
Yeah. So when someone needed to ask a question, they knew how to find me by just searching Autism Pastor.
Yeah, of course.
But messages like that from her and literally dozens and hundreds of others let me know that the disability community loves the church and they desperately want to be a part of the church. And so if it was a support system for me, I knew it would be a better support system for them. And I thought the church is the most underutilized support system for this community. And so I think that's the biggest message of the book is that, hey, church, we can be such a great support system to this often marginalized community. And, if we're able to understand these issues a little bit better, I think that we can really, really do well at helping some of the, persons with disabilities and their families reach their fullest potential. And every other organization is really doing a great job in supporting them. And I think that the church should up her game and be that support system that it should be.
Well, it sounds like you really found your calling, quite honestly.
Yeah, it was. And I tell people that it was, being diagnosed not only helped me, it helped a lot of clarity. I actually spent 2 years with the clinical psychologist that diagnosed me. I spent 2 years with her, my wife and I, after she diagnosed me, to kind of unravel things, helped me to understand my past, and really a very complicated, mysterious developmental history that I had, but I saw a parallel there with the church. Um, I was able to stumble my way through a lot of things. And the more attention I got, the more I had to deal with some of the self-taught coping mechanisms. And I saw that being very true of the church as well, particularly in the West. It stumbled through a lot of things. It's not always got things right, but it's had a lot of success. But the more success you get, the brighter the spotlight is. And you're forced at some point to deal with some of the things that you never really gave full attention to. And so for me, I just saw God calling me to step into that gap and help serve the church and serve the disability community because I've been blessed and privileged to have my foot in both worlds and can speak to both. So definitely was a new sense of calling for me.
Wow. Well, it's an interesting analogy. I had never really thought about that before. Church, and church has certainly had its own set of dysfunctions.
And it's a lot of, the development of the church is a bit mysterious. There's a lot of history that we don't know. There's a lot of things that we're learning. And I felt like, hey, this is like my life. Maybe there's a parallel there that if we spend the time. And so even in the beginning of the book, that question that I referenced earlier about asking myself, what do people experience with me? In the very beginning of the book, that's the question I challenge the church to ask itself. Because again, like I had to come to the conclusion for myself, everyone can't be wrong. And so I think that's also true of the disability community when it speaks largely of its experience of the church not being positive. At some point, the church has to say, all these people can't be wrong. There's something to this, and we need to listen closely to what they've been saying their interactions with the church have been, and how do we amplify their voices and make the adjustments that are necessary.
Well, with all the work that I've been doing with How to Heal Our Divides, the one thing that I hear from every direction is the importance of listening. And you're, just saying the same thing from yet another perspective of how that is so necessary for churches, among many others. But
right.
So can you tell us a little bit about the workshops and seminars that you lead?
Yeah. So most of them, for those who have attended them over the years, a lot of what they'll read in my book, they won't be surprised by, because these are things that I've been leading and talking about in conferences and writing about. So for example, something that made it in the book but actually stemmed from an actual breakout session that I've led for the last several years, pre-COVID, was I would do a workshop, a 90-minute workshop on how to pastor special needs families and talk about some of the differences, some of the things that they are working through that oftentimes are different from your quote unquote typical families that are not impacted by disability. And it really stemmed from after I was diagnosed, and, I have pastors and mentors who lead me and mentor me. But I realized that, once I discovered that my neurology is different, being on the autism spectrum, I almost often see things a little bit differently and experience the world a little bit differently. But that meant that I needed to be led differently. I needed to be pastored differently. And so while I might be a large group of other pastors that this particular pastor or mentor helps give leadership to, I realize some of the things that you do to help them are not always helpful to me. And sometimes some of the things that you do for them are actually barriers for me just because of the way that my brain works. And so I realized that, if that's true for me, then it's true for a lot of other families. So talking with other families and doing a lot of research, I developed a workshop and I talk about things like learning the ministry of presence. I spent about 4 years as a hospice chaplain years ago. And I learned from that experience that, as pastors, we like a microphone and we like to talk. And so sometimes one of the things I talk about in that workshop and in the book is that, asking people to interact with us socially during a time of crisis causes them to expend, precious mental and emotional energy that they need to spend in other places. And so just helping, and we're not really good at this in the West. We're not comfortable with silence. But as someone who is on the spectrum, my wife can tell you, I can spend days not talking. I often tell people, I have a word count in my head. And once I've said all the words I'm going to say for the day, my brain just shuts down. I'm done.
Wow.
I'm not going to, and that's just part of my neurology. So I'm very comfortable with silence. I'm very comfortable with being alone, but I also realize that that's not something that is the norm for most people, especially those who are public speakers. So just teaching tips like that, I actually have a large section there on how to handle grief, because the persons who are walking through this land of disability are often walking through grief. And so I do a lot of parallels, especially in that section with Psalm 23 and how David talks about how God shepherded him. And so David, who is a shepherd, is explaining how God shepherded him. And David uses a beautiful analogy of how God not only leads him to places of peace and peaceful streams, but God also walks with him through the shadows. But what's amazing about that is that God doesn't have a speaking role in that. God never says a word, but yet David is profoundly aware of God's presence. And so how do we take that and understand how to pastor families who are impacted by disability? How do we change the pace of how we do church? Because often the pace that they live life is much different. But also understanding, one of the points I make in the workshop and in the book is that when David shows up to fight Goliath, he lets us in on something that I don't even think his family knew, that he talks about having to fight lions and bears. And so I make an analogy that a lot of persons with disabilities and their families are fighting battles that we often have no knowledge of. And so the church needs to be a place of peace. And so sometimes our programs and our structure and our pace just adds to the battles that they have to fight. And one of the things I don't want for them as we try to pastor them is to put them in a place where they have to fight another battle, because they might have been fighting battles with doctors and insurance and teachers doing IEPs and those types of things. The last place they need to go and have to fight another battle is the church. So we need to learn how to shepherd them differently, not because they're deficient, but just they have different sets of needs. So that's one workshop that I've done over the years that also made it into the book.
Wow. So were you able to convert any of your workshops to be online during the pandemic?
I have not. A lot of the focus has been, really, really pushing the book. So a lot of that has come out in the interviews and the discussions and some of the guest articles I've been asked to write. And then, I started my own podcast last year. And so what I've done is I personally started a book club that I had people sign up for. And then I record those. So we've talked through each chapter. So you kind of get the workshop as I'm discussing the chapter. Yeah.
You think you'll go back to start doing them in person again once things open up?
Oh, yes. 2022 is already booking up with me. There's a couple that I do every year. I talked about the workshop for Key Ministry, which we did it online this year. And there's other conferences, some that I do every year. And then there's a lot of new ones that are opening up, both inside the church and outside the church. I have a great relationship with the Center for Autism and Related Disorders in Florida. So I do work with a lot of the universities there. So during the summer, I've been doing a lot of Zoom conferencing with them, consulting. But a lot of that is starting to open back up, as things are starting to taper off with the pandemic. So I anticipate next year be a busy travel year. Yeah.
So if churches or individuals like to get involved, with your work, what would you suggest?
I think probably if you're looking to just get more information, the best way would be to go to my website, which is autismpastor.com. And you can find a lot of the information I talk about, as we've discussed, all my books, my blogs, even links to articles I've written for other places. But then you can also find some of the organizations that I work closely with. I mentioned Key Ministry. Another great organization that does work in this area is called the Banquet Network out of the Maryland, D.C. area. I've done some work with them. And so those are great places to start if you're looking to try to at least have the discussion about making your church more inclusive to persons with disabilities and their families. Those are two great places. Well, three great places. My website, Key Ministry, Banquet Network. And then I tell people I'm not hard to find by design. And so I usually get people emailing or inboxing me on whatever social media platform they find me on, just for some advice, some consultation, telling them how to get started. And then, of course, the book is always a great way, particularly as you get to the back end of the book. I give some really practical tools on how to get started on this type of work.
Very cool. Very cool. So I have to ask any author, do you have any plans you can talk about yet about any future books?
So, I had started writing a book that I was messing around with the title. So I don't know where it's going to land. I'm already probably about 12,000 words in. Karen told me, well, send it to me when you have 5,000. But I'm still, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I want to get a couple chapters in to make sure that it's going the way that I want to. But it's sort of picking up on a theme that I talk about. And I don't know when because I've put it down for a couple of months now, just because some personal health issues that I've been dealing with. But it picks up on a key line in disability in the church, where I say, particularly talking about how we practice Christianity in the West, I have a line in there that says religion is good at teaching us to be good without actually being good to people. And so the whole premise of the next work is exploring that and where that came from, and how we have created we try to create this perception of being good without the obligation of actually being good to other people, and all the ways that shows up and how we interact with one another. So that's sort of where, and I have no idea what I'm going to call it yet. But this will be a little bit easier to write than Disability in the Church, just because that's also material that I had been working on for years, whether it's been just in writings or sermons that I preached over the years, some theological concepts. So like I said, I'm already about 2-3 chapters in. It'll probably end up being 10, 12 chapters. So we'll see how that goes. I should start picking it back up this summer and trying to finish that up and at least send it off to Karen so we could shop it around and see how it goes. I'm learning the book business.
Yes.
I'm learning that you got to get that work going, because by the time it gets out, it'll be 2 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you don't want to sit around too long, because then, if I wait, it'll be 4 years before my next book comes out. So,
right.
Yeah. I'm learning that part of the business as well.
For folks that are not familiar with the whole book business, it's very confusing and, hard to understand.
Oh yeah. I think I was doing an interview the other day, and they're asking me something about the book. And I said, I'm going to let the listeners in on a secret. By the time it gets in your hands, it's probably 2 years old to the author. So sometimes I have to say, what did I say on that page? Because
at least.
Yeah.
Well, Lamar, it was really a pleasure to find out about your work. I really thank you for doing everything that you're doing, and so glad that, your book is making a difference.
Wow. Thank you. I appreciate it.